You're listening to After Images, a podcast for cinephiles that takes a deep dive into moving images. Each episode features a special guest who is invited to explore a film of their choice. After Images is hosted by film writers Frank Bouleg and Marisa C. Hayes.
For our first episode, we are delighted to welcome author and film critic Ramsey Campbell. He's been writing for over 50 years in his native Merseyside and is regarded as one of the finest living horror writers, with over 30 published novels, including his first book, The Doll Who Ate His Mother, which was published in 1976, The Darkest Part of the Woods, 2003, and a recent anthology of film criticism, Ramsey's Rambles, published this year. His forthcoming novel, The Lonely Lands, will be published in 2023, giving us all something to look forward to in the new year.
For today's episode, Ramsey Campbell has selected the film Night of the Demon, Jacques Tournair's 1957 feature-length film based on M.R. James's short story Casting the Runes. In the film's adaptation, the story opens with a professor named Harrington, Maurice Denham, begging occultist Julian Carswell, played by Niall McGuinness, to resend the curse that's been placed upon him. Professor Harrington drives home, where a giant fire-breathing demon appears from the nearby woods. Backing the car into an electric power line, Harrington dies, and the audience is left to wonder if the demon truly exists, or if the power of suggestion is behind this freak accident. Enter the American professor John Holden, played by Dana Andrews, who has arrived in London to meet Professor Harrington at a conference where Carswell's satanic cult was scheduled to be exposed.
Learning of his colleague's untimely death, Holden follows a trail of mysterious manuscripts and encounters with the enigmatic Carswell. Holden finds himself the recipient of the same curse, which is transmitted by passing a runic parchment. Although he remains a skeptical man of science, time is running out, and Holden learns that the curse may be broken by passing the runic parchment back to the original bestower. A final sleight of hand transpires between Holden and Carswell on a moving train, with the runic parchment finally returned to Carswell. The demon makes one final appearance, and Carswell is found dead on the train tracks, though Holden remains unsure of what he has witnessed. "Maybe it's better not to know," he remarks at the film's conclusion.
Night of the Demon was released in British cinemas in 1957 and across the Atlantic the same year, with the slightly altered American title, Curse of the Demon. The film was often presented as a popular double feature in both countries. Since its release, Night of the Demon has consistently been cited as an important film and has been the subject of numerous pop cultural references, including the opening song of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, in which Richard O'Brien wrote the cheeky wordplay, "Dana Andrews said prunes gave him the runes, and passing them used lots of skills." Kate Bush has cited the film as a personal favorite and samples a line from Professor Harrington during the opening of her song, Hounds of Love. "It's in the trees, it's coming." Ramsey Campbell, thank you so much for joining us today for our very first episode ever.
Hey, my pleasure, my pleasure.
Night of the Demon is clearly a film that has really touched the collective unconscious. Can you tell us today why you chose the film for this discussion and how you first discovered the film?
Well, the simple answer to the first bit is I love it. It's the horror film I most love in the world. And I fell in love with it when I was 14 years old. Now, I should explain that in Britain in those days, virtually every horror movie had an X certificate, which meant basically you had to be, or at least seem to be, at least 16 years old before you could get in to see them. I mean, this was even true of, say, Plan 9 from Outer Space or The Giant Claw, you know. So there you go. Well, 14 years old, I was able to bluff my way past the box office. And Night of the Demon was one of the very first films I saw. As you say, it was frequently, I think pretty well always actually programmed, usually the bottom half of a double bill. I think the original release in Britain was with 20 million miles to Earth. But in this case, I thought it was a Tingler, William Castle's movie, and it was the tradition in those days actually was that the film, you get the main feature at 6 o'clock, the cinema opened, the support would come on, say 7:30, and then main feature repeated after that. And I mean, I quite like the Tingler. I'm fond of old William Castle's films, but by the end of the opening scene of Night of the Demon, well, even before that, I'd absolutely fallen in love with it. Every single thing, that voiceover over the shots of Stonehenge at the outset, the splendid Clifton and Parker score, which I think derives to an extent from Vaughan Williams, and above all, Harrington's drive to Lufford Hall through the trees at night, illuminated from beneath. I think in negative, possibly, those shots of the trees themselves, which, I much later concluded derives in part from, I think it's a testament of Dr. Mabuse, which uses a similar technique towards the end. But I mean, Tourneur was second to none in terms of using light and shadow and shade to convey the uncanny. And that opening sequence alone would have, earned it a permanent place in my consciousness. But the entire film, it got to me so powerfully. It was one of the very few films I went to see for a second time the following night. In fact, it was only on for 3 days. Such was how theatrical distribution in the suburbs in Britain tended to work in those days. So I went back and saw it again and loved it just as much. Interestingly enough, I would then actually catch up with it every time it showed up on Merseyside, and there were a lot of suburban cinemas back then, several dozens. It would always be the same copy, which was interesting, because these were the days when, no longer so obviously with digital technology. Well, you get different problems now, but in those days, a film could get chewed up in the projector at the cinema, particularly the more it was shown, the more partial it might have become. And in this case, it was in particular, the thing that always spotted was that Dana Andrews' little bit of recitation from The Ancient Mariner would always go, like one who on a lonesome road doth walk in fear and dread, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close betread. And that little bit would always be missing. So it's obviously always the same copy. The other thing that would always get chewed up was the end of the reel. So in fact, most of the wind demon scene, which Tourneur apparently had to fight producer Halley just to get proper wind machines and to get a proper windstorm. Nearly all that was gone. So you got the beginning of that, and then all of a sudden they're inside the house. But also, this is perhaps crucial. There's a bit of a myth that in America, the film was always cut down by about 8 minutes, whereas in Britain, it was originally the long version. Not so. It was never seen in Britain in that version either on the original release. It was, presumably it was submitted at one point to the censor in the full version. But by the time you look at the British Film Institute's monthly film bulletin, you'll find that the running time that they're reviewing is the shorter one. And of course, it's not merely shorter, it's substantially reconstructed, or the structure has changed to a certain extent, but maybe we'll get onto that later on. Anyway, enough from me, guys, say something.
Would you say that this being the first film that really grabbed your attention, has it really influenced the rest of your experience as a cinephile?
To an extent, yes, because in fact it was there were very the atmosphere of the film was such that, and I got to this so early that pretty well everything else was found wanting, and just the very occasional film, particularly black and white, that had that kind of atmosphere. There were very, as far as I was concerned, at least there were very, very few and far between. So, for instance, some of the Universal movies, of the Universal monster films of the 40s. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman has that wonderful opening scene with the leaves blowing through the graveyard at night. But then it then becomes rather more brightly lit, and this tends to be the case, particularly with, in fact, there's a number of films like that. The Black Castle has a sort of similar approach. You get the tremendously atmospheric opening, and then things become rather more kind of squarish and straightforward, which is not to denigrate either film. The couple of films that did do it for me in a similar way, purely in terms of the use of monochrome and atmosphere generally. City of the Dead, that John Moxey most certainly did, and when I finally got to see it uncut, The Mask of the Demon, La Maschera del Demonio, the Mario Bava Those, I suppose, those two really got to me. But yes, I tend to go because I mean, again, you see, I'm adolescent at this point, 14, going on for 15. So I wanted basically I wanted a horror movie either to be frightening or shocking, horrifying, but atmospheric would do, certainly. And those that didn't have that, just didn't get to me. And it was rather later that I'd come back to the films that I hadn't particularly liked at the time and find there's obviously so much more in early Universal movies, for example. But it wasn't until, oh, good Lord, several years later, so it would have been the early to mid 60s when the Val Newton films got a reissue in Britain. And I was able to pick up on those and find just as much there, in terms of subtlety and reticence and the way that the uncanny is conveyed, that Teneur does so well in Night of the Demon, and of course the roots are all there in the films he made with Val Newton.
And perhaps you can take us back in time to this period when you've discovered the film. I'm thinking of this kind of duality you find between modernity. We're in the post-war period. On one hand, the film opens with those beautiful, still, quiet images of Stonehenge, and we feel something ancient. But then we immediately cut to the air travel. We have the American who's arriving in the old country for a conference, and they're going to talk about new forms of science and health treatment. And there's always this kind of dynamic tension between the old and the new.
Yes, yes.
And I can imagine perhaps at the time that it felt all the more palpable. Could you maybe tell us about how it felt at the time and how perhaps your relationship to the film and that theme has evolved years later?
Yes, well, yes, I mean, that's exactly right, because I mean, I already knew the M.R. James story, of course. I mean, I knew all of M.R. James from quite an early age. And there is a sense, in one sense, obviously, that James reads nostalgically now, because it is set in Edwardian times. But I think it's crucial to say that, in terms of its readership then, it wasn't. It was happening to them. But indeed, the sort of academics who are often central to James, as indeed they are to the Night of the Demon, were very much his immediate audience. They were the people to whom he was reading the story at Christmas. But you get things like, for instance, the advertising plaque on the bus that proves to contain an uncanny message. I mean, that's very contemporary for its time. And as you say, Night of the Demon is very contemporary in terms of, but basically it has the immediacy that it needs, I think, because the crux for me about M.R. James is not so much the sort of academic background, although that's obviously very important, but it's the sheer sense of terror that he conveys, the invasion of the everyday by the utterly supernatural. And that's very much, I think, what the Teneur film gets. There is this conflict between rationality and the supernatural that's never entirely resolved, I don't think. Although it's fair to point out that, Teneur did not want to show, well, I know there's a controversy about this. I think we can probably accept that he didn't want to show it at the beginning of the film so explicitly. And therefore, because as the film now stands, we're kind of left waiting for Dana Andrews to catch up with what we already know, whereas the way Teneur planned it, presumably we would have had the same experience and not being certain of whether the supernatural exists or not. And certainly the very gradual introduction of things that aren't quite right, that wonderful shot of Carswell leaving the British Museum Library, for instance. You can't quite figure out what's wrong with that image, but there's something visually very wrong with it, the way that we're seeing it. Or, the footsteps in the hotel corridor, another wonderful scene. And obviously that extended set piece with Holden leaving Lufford Hall, going back through the woods, despite advice from Carswell, who for once seems to give him a bit of benign advice. So presumably he knows he won't take it, and therefore that's the double whammy, if you like. But yes, that tension between, but I think there's still there. The tension between the rational and the uncanny is conveyed so carefully. And there is such detail, particularly in Dana Andrews' performance, this very, very gradual, shift toward a certain, at least a certain agnosticism with regard to supernatural, but he keeps pulling it back and thinking, no, actually, it's all been about a series of conjuring tricks. No, I mean, it's a wonderful case of structure, I think. I mean, James had it, Lovecraft had it, and certainly this film has it for me.
But there's indeed a lot of splits, I think, in this film between the American in Europe, which is something that I suppose Tourneur could relate to, being French American himself, and so was his father, actually, who was also a filmmaker.
Maurice, yes.
Tourneur, who made in 1942 a very interesting horror movie called La Main du Diable, the hand of the devil's hand.
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, this dichotomy is, I think, at the root of the movie, and I think it's especially interesting in the character of Holden, in relationship to, as you mentioned, his move towards becoming someone who accepts seeing what he doesn't want to see at first. And the first shot of him we see in the film is with him covering his eyes in the plane, not wanting to see the light.
Yes, that's right. That's crucial, isn't it? Incidentally, one thing just occurs to me in passing as a parenthesis, that one film that it seems to me does do a demon in the way that, you know, we gather from his interviews Tourneur would have loved to do, is the car, you know, at Silverstein at the very end. You know, it's virtually just glimpsed in the conflagration, isn't it? And one suspects that, I mean, whether that's a conscious homage, I do not know, but it certainly reminds me of, you know, of what Tourneur used to say about his intentions, original intentions for the film. Now, funny enough, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here, but because this was a film I've been talking about earlier, well, actually last weekend, a film that seems to parallel this quite a bit is American Werewolf in London. Where again you have, you know, the American, in this case two of them, you know, coming to old England, and very much again the invasion of, you know, very much modernity by the old ways. I mean, it's almost as if a sort of Hammer Gothic in a way. You know, the scenes in the village, in the inn and on the moors. I mean, the Moors, obviously, the Hound of the Baskervilles, after all, in a way, and now invaded what was then the 1980s Britain of, you know, Margaret Thatcher. So you've actually got you've got a sort of sketch of it. You've got, you know, the moneyed classes who have, you know, dinner parties. You've got the nurse who can barely survive on her income, and you've got the homeless on the embankment, all of whom become in different ways, you know, victims of the werewolf. But this is, by the way.
I had never thought about that, and it's perfect too with this idea of, you know, sort of separating those who have seen the beast and those who haven't, and what that means, and the kind of doubt and discussion that surrounds that. And that brings me back to what you mentioned about the demon in Night of the Demon, and this whole debate about to show it, not to show it, and the kind of production dispute that happened surrounding that topic. I know that everybody has an opinion about the demon. I must admit to having a bit of a soft spot for the demon. It reminds me of some of Ray Harryhausen's wonderful work, and I think that there's that kind of mix of almost cute charm and also something terrifying about it.
Yes.
How about you? Where do you stand on the question of showing the demon?
Oh, I'm for him, but I mean, that's partly probably because I grew up with him. You know, I never realised he wasn't meant to be there. You know, so I appreciate it very much on the first viewing, and I think, you know, he does have this look of a medieval demon. You know, as obviously is demonstrated in the engravings that were shown in the course of the film. I tend to think, is there not a bit of stop motion at the very end above the train? I mean, that does look, no, it's not Harryhausen, obviously, because he wasn't involved, but you know, it could have been. I think it's, you know, it's up to his standard, if you like, or, you know, Willis O'Brien for that matter. I don't know if there's any credit for the animator, actually. I'm sure we could find it somewhere, but I don't think it's there in the, there's a very good book, Raising the Devil by Tony Earnshaw. I'm sure it's probably in there somewhere. If anybody's ever been able to find it up, I'm sure he must have done so. But no, I'm in favour of the Demon, and even the sort of relatively rickety Demon who's seen approaching through the woods before he makes off with poor old Harrington. Even that has a sort of nightmare quality. I think the very fact that it's the movement is slightly wrong actually works for me. And the outlining in flame and smoke, that seems to be a very powerful image. Oddly enough, the fact that it's moving, slightly wrong. In a way, picks up, or is picked up by. Not directly, obviously, but it seems to be there's an echo, or at least a similarity. In some of the sort of jerky apparitions that have become something more of a staple of I suppose Japanese horror movies to an extent, and also to an extent of European and American, British, that kind of thing. But then again, you see, to extend this a little bit, I can actually, even a film that has a pretty well wholly unconvincing monster may do it for me because there's somehow a dreamlike quality to it, So Attack of the Crab Monsters, I've always liked that. I've always felt that again, there's a kind of relentlessness to that film, a kind of sense of everything closing in, the island becoming smaller. And even the well, to put it mildly, not entirely convincing crab monsters still, seem to me to have come out of a sort of strange, area of nightmare. I do have my limits. From Hell It Came, and the tree stump monster, I think is more fun than anything else. But Corman, I think, knows how to do it somehow, and Turner certainly did.
Go ahead.
No, it's just that the ontological nature of the monster remains unstable, because each time we see the monster, it could be understood as the subjective point of view of the person who is being attacked by the monster itself. So it's never really absolutely clear if this is reality or the reality of the mind.
Sure, that's right.
I agree. I don't feel that it takes anything away from the ambiguity about the real existence of the demon. All we know for sure is that it must exist in the mind of those who are seeing it. But, even at the end, there's an uncertainty with maybe it's better not to know.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
And so how do you feel the film fits within the filmic production of the 1950s? Because I'm thinking about all those movies of the time from the United States that were really about UFOs. There were movies about science fiction. And to my knowledge, there were not that many films that were about the occult at that moment in time.
Not really, no. And in fact, the supernatural would only really be picked up by Hammer. Shortly after, we then get Dracula and the whole explosion of the Gothic. But no, absolutely right. That it is. I suppose the great previous British film would be Dead of Night, but of course there's more than a decade in between the two films, and even in Britain it's mainly science fiction horror, the Great Quatermass duo and X the Unknown and that kind of thing. And so no, in fact the occult is a new thing basically, and presumably we owe some of this to Charles Bennett and his screenplay. Hal E. Chester claimed that he'd written the screenplay, but then he virtually claimed he directed the film as well. I think we can safely assume he did neither of those things actually, or maybe he tinkered with the script a bit. But we've never really seen the original Bennett script. It probably doesn't exist anymore, I suppose, which was supposedly had a lot more comedy, a lot more golfing, supposedly. Which I think we probably do without, just as we might possibly do without the golfing in Dead of Night at a pinch, but perhaps that's unfair. But no, I think the film is seminal again. But of course, this presumably comes partly out of Turner's own belief in the supernatural, because he certainly declared that he did, and certainly, I Walked with the Zombies, one of the all-time great films about the supernatural. I mean, it's one of the gentlest, most delicate. Also, I think it's fair to say I think we can say it sort of respects the supernaturalism that it presents, just as in a different way, obviously a Christian way, something like Stars in My Crown, the tenor, presents a miracle, virtually with the same sort of reticence and delicacy that you see with the supernatural in the tenor Luton films and in many stretches of Night of the Demon. So I think it's one of those great instances, I suppose, of a kind of collision of perfect elements to make a greater whole, and obviously Turner was the perfect director of that film.
And it's so interesting that you mention his interest in the supernatural. I'm thinking of this wonderful, both comedic and frightening scene in the film when Dana Andrews' character in Peggy Cummins' film attend a seance, which is sort of orchestrated by Carswell's mother. And it's such a throwback to the kind of Victorian spiritualist movement with everyone around the table singing a song, Cherry Ripe, to spirits. And it's both very silly for the modern viewer, and at the same time there's that kind of eerie line that we walk again with the uncertainty of whether this has really functioned or not, and with the information that's been revealed. And do you think we can imagine that Tourneur was a bit of a spiritualist himself, that he may have subscribed to this kind of seance?
Perhaps so, yes. I mean, I suppose it's worth pointing out that pretty well, I mean, this is maybe just coincidental, but who knows? I mean, but pretty well contemporary with the film is the novel The Haunting of Hill House, the Shirley Jackson. And of course, that has a seance in it too, which was not that common in prose fiction either at the time, I don't think. I mean, as you say, it had sort of fallen out of fashion mostly with probably Edwardian fiction was the last to pick it up. Although actually Agatha Christie has a very powerful and disturbing little story called The Last Seance. If you've not read that, it's definitely worth checking out. I mean, it's a departure for her because, of course, she very seldom dealt with anything but the rational, but she did this book of supernatural stories, of which that one is probably the best.
And this interest in seances, and I would argue with the character of Carswell, possibly in people like Aleister Crowley, that is to say, with a certain form of supernatural that is more akin to the beginning of the 20th or the end of the 19th century, as opposed to the other sort of magic I see in the film, which is, and I'm coming back to what we were saying earlier, to new technologies and to the plane. I mean, Holden is flying at the beginning of the film, isn't he?
Yes.
You've got telephones, you've got electricity, you've got cars, trains. I mean, all of those technologies are I mean, I think it's Clark who used to say that any sort of highly developed technology can be understood as magic. I think that the clash between these two elements is at the root of the film and creates something powerful.
Very much so, yes, and clearly, the electric light and the hotel corridor can't dismiss the presence of the demon or whatever is there. So, I mean, it's an interesting one because I mean, somewhere I can't offhand remember who said this, but there was a comment somewhere or other that the electric light has kind of dismissed the ghost. Well, of course, it clearly isn't true, and it never will be true. The supernatural, well, as far as I can see, will always be with us in some form, and certainly, in the exploratory imagination. And far from dispelling the ghost, the electric light and these days the internet, let's say, they're not done away with. They're simply given another conduit, and so we have films like Pulse, where the internet is absolutely crucial to the supernatural element.
And in the film, it feels very much like the telephone is the continuity of this kind of creepy form of communication. Of course, we've got the ancient with the runic parchment that's passed, but at the same time, there's a lot of telephone communication in the film.
Yes.
There are sort of ambiguous messages, meetings that are arranged, bad news that's relayed via the telephone. So it does feel like that kind of supernatural, horrific communication continues.
Yes, oh yes, I think so. I mean, well, it's worth remembering that, you know, that there have been, I mean, this isn't directly a ghost story or a supernatural story about the telephone, but there have been quite a few of those. I mean, Robert Aikman wrote one called The Telephones. In fact, I beg your pardon, no. He wrote a story called Your Tiny Hand is Frozen. And I wrote The Telephones. Good Lord, you can see senility before you. Can't remember my own fiction. There you go.
But just to jump on what you were saying about electricity, I know that you are as much a fan as I am of Twin Peaks, and I was thinking,
yes.
Inspire Walk with Me, and the fact that electricity is understood as the modern fire.
Yes.
And I think there's a direct link between these two forms of elements that can burn you, but one coming from the origin of mankind and one very contemporary. And you can find this in Twin Peaks, but you can definitely find this in Night of the Demon as well.
That's right. Well, of course, the connections made explicitly with the falling of the power line, you know, on poor old Harrington. So and in fact, you know, those are the two interpretations of what happens to him. So sure.
What do you think about the tempo of the film? I was really struck by the hectic nature of the film. It grabs you right from the start with that car racing through the forest, and it keeps going like this. And if I may just add a little something, I really like the fact that you've got this surface of hectic time on top of something that is really about deep time, with monoliths, with things coming from archaic times, and there's a tension there that is very powerful, I find.
It is, because it's different in the two versions of the film, isn't it? Because, you know, the short version is much more headlong, if you like, most of the major scenes have got, you know, bits taken out of them, and sometimes crucially so. And obviously we missed the entire very important episode of the visit to the farmhouse to get the family to agree to have Rand Hobart put under hypnosis. But yes, I mean, time is, well, of course, the single most crucial image of that is the clock at the station that skips ahead past the time that, in theory, is the last moment Holden can possibly catch up with Carswell, but not so. But of course, it's a classic Hitchcockian suspense device, I think, among many other things. But clearly, as you say, thematically related too.
I'm thinking here about the question of adaptation, and even though in the film, you know, there are a lot of modern elements that are absent from M.R. James's short story. And obviously this is a feature-length film, so the drama has to be drawn out a bit longer in terms of its temporality. But what do you think about adaptation as an author who, you know, I know that several of your books have been adapted for feature-length films that we've enjoyed. What do you feel about this adaptation from short story to feature-length film?
Well, I mean, I think it just in more general terms, my attitude is, you know, obviously one I've tested now because I've been filmed, you know, books of mine have been filmed, is, you know, I'd much rather have a film that is you know, has power of its own, rather than, you know, a dull, faithful adaptation of the original. And, you know, as you say, you know, to build a feature film out of a short story, you have to expand it. Actually, I mean, I think it's very wittily expanded in all sorts of ways. And I think, and also, I do think about the word objects at the time. You know, Peggy Cummings is introduced as a sort of romantic interest. Well, actually, she's not really, isn't it? I mean, the relationship is very important, but there's never really a sense that they're going to go off together at the end. It's much more likely, you know, he'll get on his plane back to America, and she'll be left alone, you know, having been bereft of her father. But no, the fleshing out of the characters, but above all, what seems to me to be an absolute masterstroke on the part of, well, we assume it has to be Charles Bennett, is the extraordinary fleshing out of Carswell as this enormously complicated character. I mean, he is surely one of the great villains of of film. I'll go that far. You know, there's such detail, so many layers to the character. And also, I'll also stick my neck on the block further and say I think that Neil McGuinness's performance is one of the great performances of British cinema by any standard. So that alone, I mean, that whole development of the film, you know, seems to me to raise it from, you know, a very good film to a great one, among other things.
He's a very evil character, but at the same time, it's interesting to see that he has a very close relationship to his mother. He has this moment with children that is also very sweet.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Which, of course, is the reverse of the piece in of the scene in the James, where, you know, he's terrified the children with these horrid images from a projector.
I was doing some etymology about the name Carswell, and I came up with the explanation that Carswell comes from a well of watercress. And I thought it was interesting to see, I mean, the image of the well that is connecting the surface of reality to what's underneath, to the unconscious, I think really applies well to that character, doesn't it?
Yes. Oh, yes. Gosh, yes. Yes. Well, again, I'm in parentheses. I'm reminded of the well in the Colour Out of Space, the Lovecraft story, which is, you know, the classic the classic horrific well, I think, in the literature. And certainly it can be taken on one level as an image of the subconscious. You know, we even have the image of somebody sort of poking a long pole down it and not being able to find the bottom, but just a sense of something very dreadful lurking down there.
And speaking of dread and other ancient things, I was curious to know if you have other stories or films that might focus on runes, and if you have any recommendations for us.
I don't think we have any runic films, do we, at all? I mean, I think there are films that parallel or, you know, are in some way similar to A Night of the Demon. I mean, I think Ringu, the Japanese film, and that whole series. But I mean, I think the first film is for me the most effective and relatively speaking the simplest. And then we get obviously complication upon complication with the various sequels. But the image of Sadako crawling out of the television is surely a classic instance again of the ancient, you know, invading the modern, or, you know, in fact using the modern as a conduit to get into the everyday world. But there you have, I think, something like the runic parchment, you know, the videotape that has to be passed to somebody in order to save you from the, you know, from its dreadful consequences. And the other film, although this does not have a runic, it doesn't have any physical device, but a film I like very much is It Follows, which again, you know, certainly has a sense of passing the, whatever it might be, the curse, you know, to somebody else in order to save yourself. But the method in that film is, you know, is so oblique that, you know, it in many cases, you know, they can't be quite sure that they've done it. And I mean, I still find the ending of that film deeply ambiguous. I'm never quite certain what has happened or what is going to happen, but it resonates in the mind. And curiously enough, this is again just a passing thought. The image of the only graphic moment in that film is the unlucky victim seen on the beach in the opening passage of It Follows, which is very much like the climax of a James story, A Warning to the Curious, where somebody's found, you know, terribly mutilated and battered on a beach. Whether again this is a conscious echo, I don't know, but those two films, I suppose, would be the ones that I would cite as not necessarily directly referring to Night of the Demon, but certainly being in the tradition of, if you like.
I feel slightly reassured now, because I assumed that there must be loads of other films and horror stories related to runes. And when I started doing research, I found that it wasn't so easy to come up with titles.
I mean, there is, I suppose, a parallel short story, He Cometh and He Passeth By, Russell Wakefield, H. Russell Wakefield, which has a similar device. And interestingly enough, while I think we're reliably informed that Carswell in the James story is not based on Crowley. The character in the Wakefield story very plainly is based on Crowley. And it's possible, I don't know this, but I don't know whether anybody does know that, that the McGinnis character may be to draw to any extent on that. I'm not sure.
But I really like the connections you've made with Japanese cinema and with this idea of contagion that can be found. And Marissa has written a book about Ju-on, which has a lot of echoes, I think, with Ringu. But in all of the cases you've mentioned, what transpires as far as I'm concerned, is the idea of undecidability. It's never really certain which way it is. I mean, we can never truly make our mind about the real meaning of what we've just seen. And I think that it goes back to M.R. James at the root, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, he actually had this dictum. He would say that, he would, that perhaps you would have some kind of a possibility of an explanation, a rational explanation, but that wouldn't quite fit everything in the story, and so the supernatural is still a distinct possibility at the very least. And I think on the whole, in terms of his fiction, he would tend to come down on the side of the existence of the uncanny, as indeed I think the Turner film does as well.
And to a certain extent, it also connects the film to, I was thinking about the last scene when we see the monster killing Carswell over the train. To me, it feels very Lovecraftian.
Yes.
Like Cthulhu, big monster that is enormous, coming from the depth of time. And Lovecraft kept saying that if we understood everything in the universe, we would go mad. And I think there's a nice parallel there between what Lovecraft used to say and this undecidability that perhaps is the best way to stay sane.
Yes. That's a lot to know, as is exactly the same thing, really. That's right.
But I thought it was interesting what you mentioned about East Asian cinema, which has so long been interested in the idea of ancient curses, but I think since the 90s has been really, really talented at bringing them to the screen and adapting them in collaboration with modern technology, curses that are transferred through video, through mobile telephones, etc. And I'm thinking about the question of moral responsibility, where it's quite shaky in some of the East Asian films, because sometimes one has to transmit the curse to a certain number of people to be able to escape it. And so then there's the whole moral dilemma around whether you're going to give this to your friends and your family, to some unknown person. Whereas I think in Night of the Demon, it's rather clear, this idea of exchange, of giving it back to the person who gave it and sort of taking back the responsibility of this curse. Would you say that the moral issue is a little clearer perhaps in Night of the Demon?
Oh, I think so. Yes. Although and it's interesting that there's a kind of sense that this is that Carswell himself may somehow have been responsible, or I beg your pardon, has been the target in some way of the same thing. At the very least, that the powers that he's acquired, bring this dreadful responsibility that he has somehow to transfer to somebody else. But yes, I think that there certainly is that sense that Dana Ramsey is doing the right thing by passing it back. And indeed, it's the Indian gentleman who pretty well makes this point, and indeed so does Carswell's mother. I mean, which is kind of a touching setup in the sense that she's basically responsible for the death of her own son. But again, what else can she do, having throughout the film tried everything else? I mean, that relationship is actually very powerful. I suppose it's no accident that Charles Bennett wrote several films for Hitchcock as well, where the mother figure is often paramount, whether it be Psycho or North by Northwest or Marnie for that matter. So again, there's more the hint of Hitchcock, I think, in the Night of the Demon.
And do you think that the film has influenced your fiction writing? Has it had did you think that some of your books may have had elements that came directly or indirectly from it?
Probably indirectly, although though not so much thematically as the use of reticence. But then, you know, that again comes from M.R. James. So I suppose you know the two of them kind of, you know, became focused in my stuff. Sure, yeah, it'd be surprising if they weren't.
Can you tell us a little bit about writing that you have coming up? Any projects that you're currently working on? Did we get the release date right for The Lonely Lands, that we can look forward to that in 2023?
Yes, indeed. It's August 2023, preceded actually by a reissue. They're doing Flame Tree. My publicist will be doing Ancient Images, which is my novel about a lost Karloff and Lugosi 1930s British horror movie and what underlies that. But yeah, right now, Lord, it never ends. You see, the pressure of fiction, untold stories. So I'm somewhere, I don't know, 2/3 maybe through the first draft of a new novel called The Incubations. And curiously enough, that's about, now you mention it, or now I'm reminded of it, that's about the sort of transference of a curse in a way. I mean, I don't like to talk too much about works in progress because, you know, they're not finished yet. But suffice it to say that it's about somebody who goes to visit a twin town. You know, it's quite common, you know, that a town in Britain says twinned with a town in Europe, and what he brings back unbeknownst to himself with him, which then begins to well, basically he's a carrier for it, and it begins to make itself felt in the community. So, you know, nightmares from abroad, basically. So somehow this sounds a bit like Night of the Demon, doesn't it?
Indeed. And what happens when we travel? What do we discover there?
That's right, that's right.
Would you say that this has been somehow influenced by the current pandemic?
This one, no, not really, although I see your point. But no, The Lonely Lands, certainly, or not influenced directly. I mean, I mean, some of us had this discussion actually about, you know, in the midst of the pandemic, a bunch of writers, you know, are we now obliged to at least to acknowledge it in our fiction? You know, can we get away with not doing so? Well, it seemed to me that, you know, you read, I don't know, Hemingway or Virginia Woolf or Scott Fitzgerald in the 20s, and you won't get much sense of the Spanish flu epidemic. So I would say, no, we don't have to include it. And I wasn't going to, in fact. But The Lonely Lands, I was developing the idea before I actually started writing the novel. And it suddenly became apparent to me, well, actually, the COVID pandemic was the absolute background for what happens in this book. And I hadn't, in a sense, perhaps it had suggested itself, you know, in the development of the book without my knowing this. I mean, just waiting there to be, in my development of the book, I mean, not in reality, just waiting there to be noticed. And so, yes, that does become well, basically the starting point of what happens in that novel. But you know, that's how my subconscious works. It does stuff before I know it's doing it, but that's how I like to do it, basically.
Fantastic. And I know that us readers are really, really looking forward to the release of these new books.
Well, hope you like them. Hope you like them. And of course, there's also, I mean, I'll remind Frank, there's my monograph on the Three Stooges to come. And with luck, that probably will be next year as well, I think.
Oh, fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Well, it's my personal journey. I mean, it's a very strange one. You see, an old friend of mine, sadly no longer with us, but John Owen, who was a fellow film buff and writer, he was published by Arkham House as well. And he always preferred the Three Stooges to Laurel and Hardy. Now I found this impossible to believe personally, but there you go. And I hadn't seen very much of the Stooges, and I hadn't really engaged with them at all. When Channel 4 opened up in Britain, the TV channel, it originally, you know, was meant to be an sort of an alternative channel, and so it did all sorts of stuff that other channels were not doing. And they were programming the Columbia shorts, the Stooges, in the early afternoon, and I would watch them. And again, I thought, you know, is this funny? You know, but I kept coming back to them. This was the thing. There was something there that kept me coming back. And when Sony started issuing these very splendid slipcase sets chronologically of all the Columbia shorts that they made, and of it all the Stooges, not because obviously there were more than 3 Stooges, hence my title, 6 Stooges and Counting, for this monograph. I was interested enough that I bought them as they came out and watched them, and I was then invited by my publishers, PS Publishing, or one of my publishers, who have a movie monograph imprint called Electric Dreamhouse. They wanted me to do a book. I really said I wasn't clear that I could do an entire book on a single film. And then I thought about, well, what about doing the Stooges? And I then went back and began seriously to look at the films again, having now got the entire chronology, and then sort out everything else I could possibly find. And the more I looked, the more I saw, which I mean is as far as I'm concerned, the function of fiction and of criticism, to look again at stuff we've taken for granted, or one of the functions. And so I just became fascinated by them, and the extraordinary business of replacing the Stooges, the third Stooge, throughout the career, and then this extraordinary business that kind of prefigures Plan 9 again in a way of what Sam Raimi calls the fake Shemp, the guy with his back to the camera playing Shemp because Shemp has died in the interim, and they've got to use all this footage somehow, and then the bizarre sort of increasing tendency of Columbia to recycle footage. So eventually you get 20-minute movies, 10 minutes of which or more consist of stuff you've already seen and reconstructed and reworked, like a first draft, into a final draft. And all this became fascinating to me. And so ultimately, more than 70,000 words worth of a kind of personal journey. So, well, I mean, I hope what happens is it makes some people look again at the Stooges. Because I mean, I think it's Bridget Fonda who says, if you don't like the Stooges, that must be because you've never really looked at them. And I'm inclined now to agree with her.
And for someone who's never watched a movie of the Stooges, could you suggest one to start with?
Ooh, yes, I'd say if it's going to be a short film, then Disorder in the Court, which has one of Curly's great episodes in the courtroom, which again, you see this recycling thing. Jules White, who was there, was the main director of Columbia Comedy Shorts, and became their main director, had previously filmed this scene several years ago, because he was a great man for recycling his own material, with Buster Keaton, no less. And if you compare the two, I think it is fair to say that Curly's timing is the equal of Buster's, and you can't say fairer than that. So I'd say, yeah, have a look at Disorder in the Court, and that. Or there's one called, and it's a very odd title because it's meaningless both in terms of the film and in terms of the character, called Violent as the Word for Curly, which is not particularly violent at all, actually, but has all sorts of inventive stuff and makes clear, and both of those films do, and this is one of the points, I think, is that they were by no means only about knockabout. There's a great deal more to them than that, and you get a lot of what else there is to them in both those films.
Great recommendations and high praise. Thank you.
No, you bet.
Before we close this first episode of our podcast, is there one question about Night of the Demon that we didn't ask and that you wished?
No, I don't. I think you did remarkably well. I mean, I'm sure there's infinitely more to say about the movie than we've said, but well, that's what makes it such a great film. So, it's infinitely rewarding as far as I'm concerned. Come back to it every time I see new things. And there's that splendid British Blu-ray set on Indicator, which has every possible version of the film you could possibly want. All 4 edits, technically speaking, and including the 2 major differences in the long and the short version. And well, all I can say is you've now made me want to go and have a look at them both again.
Thank you. And that reminds me too that unfortunately these days we don't have the experience to watch too many double features anymore. But
That's
of
true.
course, we're free to program that at home ourselves. So.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having joined us for this first episode of our podcast.
After Images.
It's always a pleasure to chat with you.
Well, this is my pleasure, Marisa and Frank. Thank you very much for having me. Let's do it again soon.
Yes, with pleasure. And we really look forward to the new books, and good luck with your current projects.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to After Images. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and follow After Images podcast on social media.